In this video, we'll be discussing W.E.B. Du Bois, an American sociologist who wrote widely on the experience of Black life and identity in the early 20th century. If you've been keeping up with this lecture series so far, you might be under the impression by now that all the early sociologists were old German guys. Well, that's kind of true among those who have historically been influential as the founders of sociology. But in the past decade or so, the discipline has begun to challenge this by increasingly including Du Bois into discussions of the sociological classics. The popularization of critical theory perspectives and growing disciplinary focus on race and culture seem to have created a new appreciation for Du Bois' early contributions to the intellectual landscape of sociological theory. So today, we happily welcome our newest addition to the sociological canon, W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and earned 3 degrees from Harvard University, including a PhD, making him the very first African American to earn a doctorate there. Du Bois was said to be a serious and distant person, insisting that everybody refer to him as Dr. Du Bois. Du Bois dressed formally, carried a walking stick, and moved with an air of confidence and dignity. He was highly disciplined, rising at 7:15 and in bed by 10 o'clock nearly every day throughout his life. While attending Friedrich Wilhelm University for graduate work in Germany, he met the famous sociologist Max Weber, who was apparently so impressed with Du Bois. Maybe there really is no getting around the Germans in classical sociology. In 1897, Du Bois began teaching the still new discipline of sociology at Atlanta University. After arriving at his new professorship in Atlanta, Du Bois wrote a series of articles that were generally supportive of Marxism. He was not initially a strong proponent of labor unions or the Communist Party, but he felt that Marx's scientific explanation of society and the economy were very useful for explaining the situation of African Americans in the United States. A co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known today as the NAACP, Du Bois served as the editor of its magazine, The Crisis, where he wrote widely on issues like lynching, racial discrimination, and the importance of education. In later years, Du Bois became more radical in his politics, advocating for global decolonization and aligning himself more explicitly with socialist causes. In 1961, he joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana. It's kind of hard to blame him for that, considering that the Civil Rights Act hadn't even been passed at the time, and thus Du Bois had spent pretty much his entire life up to that point living in a country in which he was both legally discriminated against and widely viewed as culturally and intellectually inferior, despite his obvious talent. Du Bois died in Ghana in 1963, at the impressive age of 95. It's important to note that Du Bois was an advocate for Pan-Africanism, a social movement and ideology which promotes the unity of African nations and peoples across the world to collectively resist and overcome the impact of colonialism and racism. Like many Black activists of his era, he was targeted by the FBI, and a trial was brought against him under suspicions that he was an agent of a foreign state. However, the case was dismissed as soon as the judge learned that none other than Albert Einstein had offered to appear as a character witness in his defense. As a side note, Du Bois was also a pioneer of data visualization. He had a talent for quantifying and illustrating the socioeconomic position of the Black community, and, in my opinion, a pretty tasteful sense of aesthetics. I'll be cycling through some of his remarkable visualizations of Black life in America throughout this video, so keep your eyes peeled. Du Bois is perhaps best known for his 1903 work, The Souls of Black Folk, in which he explores the social position of Black Americans at the dawn of the 20th century. Here, Dubois offers an eloquent examination of the struggle for identity, acceptance, and advancement faced by African Americans in their struggle for social equality. One of the most important concepts from this work is what Dubois calls the double consciousness of Black life. For African Americans, this double consciousness represents the tension between their American identity and their African heritage. Dubois contends that this duality creates a sense of two-ness, where one is both American and Black, a combination of identities which he felt society considered to be incompatible. This duality forces African Americans to constantly consider how they are being perceived by the white majority, leading to an internal conflict where they must negotiate between their own self-conception and the stereotypes of others. Dubois' insistence on being referred to as Dr. Dubois was perhaps a consequence of his own self-consciousness in this respect. In his own words, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." In the decades since Dubois first introduced the term of double consciousness, its use has been expanded beyond that of the Black population. Today, it is used to describe the experiences of other marginalized individuals and social groups who must also navigate through different cultural, social, and identity landscapes. For example, a woman working in a field predominantly occupied by men, like engineering, could also experience this sense of double consciousness. She is constantly aware of her gender in the workplace, having to fight against the stereotype that women are less competent in such fields, and must balance her actions to be seen as neither too feminine nor too masculine. In The Souls of Black Folk, Dubois introduces an interesting metaphor: the veil. For Dubois, the veil represents several things in the context of the African American experience. First, and most directly, it signifies a visual, racial distinction that influences how African Americans are perceived and treated in society. On a deeper level, however, the veil symbolizes the socio-cultural division between Black and white societies in the United States. This veil hinders mutual understanding and equality between the races by distorting each group's view of the other, and in some cases, of themselves. On one side, it prevents the white community from seeing the Black community as truly American, or as even fully human, deserving of equal rights. On the other side, this veil can grant African Americans a unique perspective of understanding, critiquing, and challenging American society and its racial dynamics, a consequence of their dualistic experience of both Black and American identity. I actually found it kind of challenging to pin down a concrete definition of the veil in Dubois' various works. We're sort of left to piece together what he means by his various allusions to it. However, I think the general sentiment of this concept is communicated well in the following passage. "Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All, nevertheless, flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town.' Or, 'Do not these southern outrages make your blood boil?' At these I smile. To the real question, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' I answer seldom a word." In this passage, the veil is what places such a question between Dubois and the so-called other world of which he speaks. Importantly, we see that the veil can be acknowledged on both sides, and yet it retains the power to create confusion and awkwardness. But where does this veil come from? I think Du Bois would say that, rather than having a single source, we should imagine the veil to be a sum of a totality of things, such as the cultural legacies and historical inertia of racism, as well as the severe material inequalities between the races. Finally, the veil represents the psychological and sociological constraints which limit opportunities and aspirations of African Americans due to systemic racism and socioeconomic factors. In some senses, the veil is a gown of ideological domination, and thus it can cause the wearer to regulate their own thoughts and behaviors in accordance with the dominant norms. For example, a black woman in Du Bois' day might not even begin to imagine herself as a university professor, because the veil effectively conceals her own potential from her. Central to Du Bois' work was his concept of the color line. The color line is a metaphor which illustrates the socioeconomic and political divisions that are drawn and maintained along racial lines around the world. As Du Bois put it, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea. Du Bois sought to draw attention to the existence of the color line and the scale of the problems it produced with many of his data visualizations. He used the color line to discuss the ways in which the black population remained at a social disadvantage due to systemic and institutionalized structures of racism, which could not simply be legislated away. Despite the 13th Amendment and eventual passage of the Civil Rights Act, the problems caused by the historical oppression of the black community had not and would not simply disappear overnight. They were baked into the social fabric of the United States. The color line is therefore not just a literal delineation of spaces divided by race, but also a psychological and socioeconomic divide, perpetuating structures of racial inequality. It impacts everything from access to quality of education and healthcare, to job opportunities and the accumulation of generational wealth. We might interpret this concept as an early precursor to critical race theory, a modern school of thought which posits that racism is not merely a product of individual biases, but is rather embedded in the structures and systems of society. Anyway, I'll probably do a separate video on critical race theory at some point because I know that's kind of a spicy topic. So, as we can see, much of Du Bois' contributions to sociology come from the language and concepts he provided that help us acknowledge and talk about race. His concepts of double consciousness, the veil, and the color line provide invaluable insights into the struggle for Black identity, acceptance, and equality. While these theories were born out of the African American experience, they can also be broadened to describe the experiences of other marginalized individuals and social groups. Today, these concepts continue to resonate, helping to illuminate some of the deep-seated racial inequalities that remain embedded in society. That said, before we finish off here, I want to highlight the fact that, despite his university professorship and academic work, Du Bois was primarily an activist. He spent the majority of his life dedicated to the advancement of the Black community through relentless networking, conferencing, and community-building efforts, organizing several mass demonstrations, serving as a United Nations delegate, and playing a key role in the establishment of the NAACP. In his own words, one could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. The cure wasn't simply telling people the truth, it was inducing them to act upon the truth. Well, I guess we'll just leave it there today. I hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you in the next video.